So let's talk a little bit more about setting the price. And so you've got your agent around. We've looked at the price. We've got some figures in our heads. We know hopefully the motivation of the seller. We know our market. We know current supply and demand. We know what impact the interest rates are having. We've got an idea as to how we'll communicate that price, but there's still an overall way that we communicate price to make sure we get the very best price for our property. And I'm going to offer you three options here. So what is the best pricing strategy to ensure that we are going to get the very best price for our property? Is it marketing at a very high price so that we leave room for offers? Is it number two, marketing at a competitive price which will attract interest and competition? Or is it number three, marketing at a price that the agent feels will flush out the very best buyers without the property appearing overpriced or cheap? And the answer is, drumroll please, number three. The key to maximizing price to ensure that the correct buyers can have access to its marketing. That's mainly online. And as I said before, we're going to look at a following example. So before we move on, a lot of the time, and this is for me the worst possible advice that you can ever be given, is let's put the price really high so that we leave ourselves room for an offer. Because what that does, it basically cuts out a huge demographic. It could cut out by a matter of thousands of pounds a marketplace that really should be looking at your property but isn't. And if we look at the fact that 93%, even probably as much as 98% of all searches, of all property inquiries come via the internet, then it's a really flawed offer. And I'll give you an example when we move on to the next screen. Number two, marketing the other way. So, an agent that might market the property at a very competitive price will certainly attract a lot of interest and a lot of competition. But a lot of that will be time wasted in so much that, they'll achieve the guide price or the asking price very easily and then just create even more work by going into sealed bids and ending up with a portion of buyers who really were willing to pay the best possible market price for the property, which you may have found anyway by marketing it slightly higher. So coming in low at the other end certainly doesn't necessarily do you any favors, and it duplicates, for me, a lot of work, and it sort of ends up with a lot of potential lowball offers that we know are just never going to be acceptable to you as the client. So the price that the agent feels will flush out the very best buyers willing to pay the very best price without the property appearing either too expensive or too cheap is the agent that's going to perform, is the agent that has the best understanding of market and internet and marketing dynamics. And I'm going to show you a following example of, an area of marketing that very few agents are going to show you or tap into, but that has an astronomical impact on what we call your traffic, your click-through rate, the amount of inquiries that your agent can generate. And make no mistake, this is not the old days of agency where, agents are sitting down with big lists of people to ring through and call. Simply because, as I mentioned earlier, people don't have time to go into those agents anymore. The majority of agents do their business via aggressive marketing campaigns via the internet. To miss that kind of marketplace, and a busy London marketplace, is damaging to your campaign. So let's look at this following example. So what I've got here is a page. This is the initial property page on Rightmove. So as you can see, we've got our location. When we look for a property, we've got to type in a search radius. So we can either say, no, we only want to buy in, and I've used SE1 as this example right here. And this is the real, this is the real holy grail right here, the price range. And it's amazing how many agents just do not think about this particular factor, because this is what's going to determine who sees your property online. And obviously, of course, a website like rightmove.com, as I said before, we're talking about, 98% of buyers looking at this kind of internet platform in the very first instance on their property search, you cannot afford to be cutting out your biggest marketplace. So I'll give you an example of how bad agents are in some cases when it comes to actually understanding where your price should be pitched. So as you can see, we're required to put in a price range, and most of the time as buyers, we'll be putting in, a minimum, let's say 500,000. And if we look here, let's say we've got the next bands up. As you can see, Rightmove, for example, works in these increments. So you can cut off your maximum at 550. You can cut off your maximum at 600, 650, 700. Then after 700, you'll notice that it goes up in increments of £100,000. Whereas between £500,000, it goes up in increments of only £50,000. Once it goes over £1 million, it then goes up in £250,000 increments until you get to 2 million and then £500,000 and so on. So pricing within these bands for me are very, very important. So I'll give you an example. Do you think that if you had a property that you would accept, let's say, a figure of £550,000 for, do you think it would be then acceptable to take the estate agent's advice that we should leave room for offers and market your property at, let's say, a figure of £570,000? And you'll see exactly why that's a problem here, because all of a sudden what we do is that by now listing off our property that we would sell gladly for £550,000, but we're leaving buffers for offers at, we're pricing at 570,000. All of a sudden I am now talking to a different marketplace online, because all of those buyers who actually say, well, I can't afford to pay more than £550,000 for my property, and that's where I'm going to cut off my search, now don't see our property. They're not even visible online to them. So in other words, the criteria that we're now asking our marketplace to look at is up to £600,000. So straight away, we are losing a huge portion of would-be purchasers just by miscommunicating the price. And I think that's probably the foremost reason why property at the moment is unsold, or property remains unsold. And whether that's down to coming back to the motivation of the seller being somewhat unrealistic, or just bad advice by the estate agent in terms of where to actually pitch that price to make sure they're attracting the best possible click-through and traffic. Far better for the property to actually be at £550,000, because what happens now is that the volume of traffic looking between 500 and 550,000, let's assume, is going to be greater than those who can afford £600,000. So we're just basically competing with a better type of property that we know is going to be more favourable to applicants looking within that price range. That doesn't mean to say the price will only stay at 550. The best way to engineer and flush out if a property is worth more is to get the right amount of relative buyers through the door. The concern that you have now with your property at 575 is that invariably the buyer profile of the person that's clicked through to your property can afford to spend, let's assume, £600,000. And because they can spend £600,000, it might mean that they're looking at properties maybe with an extra bedroom, a slightly bigger garden, an extra bathroom, maybe with a slightly better finish. All of a sudden, you're now competing with a property that's maybe on the market at £600,000 that may actually offer or may actually be more suited to a buyer who's actually looked up to £600,000. So the best way to always flush out the very most money that your property is worth is by not missing your target audience. And I can't stress this point enough, especially if it's a price that you know you'd be happy to accept. Then your property should be at £550,000. Now, that doesn't mean to say that's where the property will stay. Again, the dream scenario is, because we're making our window nice and wide to our marketplace, we're attracting the right demographic, the right buyers are coming through the door. And if we engineer a situation, or your agent engineers a situation where you've got 2 or 3 people falling over themselves to pay the guide price, then great stuff. You know, you're now into the realms of going to sealed bids, asking them for full and final offers, etc. And then we'll find out how much the property is really worth. But the best way to engineer that scenario, especially in a marketplace which is a little bit more price sensitive as it is now, is to make sure that you are not missing out. And it's such a travesty to be on the market at levels just above where those thresholds are online. So I hope that's proved really useful for you, and that you understand a little. Zoopla works a little bit different in terms of their price structure, and they're a little bit more flatter. And I think once you get over £1 million, you can go up in increments of 100,000. So for me, a good agent needs to understand the price point, especially online, where it's going to have the biggest impact for you as a seller. Okay, so I hope that's proved useful. This is something that I always talk about in my marketing pitches, and I think the effect of it cannot be underestimated, especially as, you know, to be honest, this is where most of your customers or most of your buyers really are.